I was implored to do this research on the school desegregation, specifically the Cleveland school desegregation case, by one of my co-authors and the lead attorney for the school deseg case, attorney James Hardiman. James and I have done a considerable amount of civil rights work together. I refer to him as Batman and myself as Robin. And somewhere around 2010, we were at a community forum, and he just gave me a directive after the meeting: meet me at my office at 6 o'clock on Tuesday. I said, okay. I arrived there. In walks the late retired federal judge Nathaniel Jones, the Reverend Charles Lucas, and these other luminary figures from the civil rights era and movement and leaders in Cleveland and nationally. And the objective was to discuss the school desegregation case. James kept telling me we had to write this history up, we had to write this up. That was the impetus to starting the research on this topic. I, being a native Clevelander, I graduated from John Adams High School in 1979 in the midst of the school desegregation case, the implementation of what's referred to as busing primarily. I recall I had just returned to Cleveland from attending school in North Carolina, the 10th and 11th grade. And needless to say, I didn't want to get bused. I was just trying to graduate high school, and I lived a block over from John Adams High School. So I didn't want to get caught up in that. And needless to say, my school wasn't bust. Busing, as it is, started in 78, and it was phased in over 3 years. So fully implemented in 1980, starting in 78. And John Adams was not part of that second phase. I'm a professor of urban studies at Cleveland State University, and I had just earned tenure, I think, in 2010. So I was due for sabbatical, and I needed a research project or something to focus on during my sabbatical. And I said, well, this book would be an ideal subject or topic. So that was the context within which we started this research. Reached out to a couple of colleagues that I knew that had done work in the area of school desegregation and civil rights and education policy overall. They ultimately became our co-authors. I was the lead author or editor of the book, having been a journalist in the military, a public affairs specialist. I felt a significant responsibility to chronicle this history. Cleveland has a very rich history relative to civil rights and racial activism and progress. I argue Cleveland was one of, if not the most progressive Black community during the 1960s in the country. Now, I qualify that or bookend that with the statement: since that time, we've been one of the most regressive, if not regressive in the country in that regard. And there's ample evidence to support that argument when you look at, the fact that we were the first major city to elect Carl Stokes, an African American mayor of a major U.S. city in 1967, a time when blacks were only 37% of the population. You look at the Cleveland Summit, which occurred here, Malcolm X giving his ballot or the bullet speech here, Dr. King using Cleveland to raise funds after being jailed in Birmingham, where he wrote the letter from a Birmingham jail. So just so many other examples that I could provide to support that argument. Activism played a significant role in pushing for school desegregation in Cleveland. Many aren't aware, as I was not until we started this project, that Cleveland was the first northern challenge to school desegregation in the urban north, post Brown v. Board. If you look at school desegregation post Brown v. Board, the South desegregated much more significantly than in the North. And it wasn't until we started researching and interviewing some of our respondents or interviewees for this book, and specifically the late Congressman Lewis Stokes, that informed us of the fact that this was, it was part of the National Urban League strategy to use Cleveland as a test case, if you will, to challenge segregation in the urban north. And that case, the 1964 Craggett versus Cleveland Public Schools, was actually the first challenge to northern school desegregation or segregation. Ironically and surprising to me, when we started these discussions and James started telling me of this history of the case that led to the 73 case, Reed versus Rhodes case, when he mentioned Craggett versus Cleveland Public Schools, that last name, it rang a bell for me because I was stationed with a guy in the military named Charlie Craggett. Well, lo and behold, it was Charles Craggett, the son of Daisy Craggett, who filed that case on behalf of her then juvenile or son, adolescent son, and 20 other Cleveland Public School students. The average parent of children in the Cleveland Public Schools at the time were very involved in activism and the protests and demonstrations pushing for a desegregated school system. Once again, as we were working on this book, we looked at the photographs from some of those protests and demonstrations that were held down at the Cleveland School Board of Education building, and you had thousands of people. The massive size of those crowds is just awe-inspiring. I mean, and I juxtapose and compare that to the more recent protests and demonstrations that have been held in the city of Cleveland in the wake of various police shootings and police misconduct. And they pale in comparison. And these were just your average mother and father that have working families, working class families that were being arrested, and brutalized, but yet and still protesting and demonstrating on behalf of their children. And when you think of it in the context of the Great Migration to the North, these are those first generation migrants from the rural South, and in Cleveland, primarily a significant portion of the African American community having roots in Alabama and Georgia second, I think. That's significant, that's important, because when you think of that legacy of the civil rights movement from Alabama, Birmingham, Mobile, Dr. King, all of those connections. And Cleveland is referred to as Alabama North, if you will. So when you think of that spirit of resistance and activism that obviously they brought with them to Cleveland, to the North, and then the reasons that they came north, not only for better economic opportunities, but for educational opportunities for their children and the futures of their children, economically, socially, educationally, just a better opportunities and quality of life for their children. That was their aspiration. So they were very ardently involved in pushing for those types of opportunities and reform. So, as you point out, the student transfer, which was referred to by the media as busing, it was the most controversial and sensationalized aspect of the court remedies, of which there were 12. It was but one. There was student transfer, there was teacher and administrative transfers of administrators. There was addressing the curriculum, looking at bias in the curriculum was another initiative, and then just the allocation of resources. So there were a wide array of remedies, but once again, the media and the general public focused on the most sensational aspect of those court remedies, and that being busing. The testing, addressing the bias found in testing and just in the curriculum in general. The data, and we present that in our book, the data shows that there was a decrease in what is referred to as the achievement gap between Black and white students during that period of the implementation of the court order. Now, and even a decrease in the dropout rate among Black students in particular during that time period. So there was progress being made, but once again, that gets lost in this argument as busing being the cause and catalyst for population loss and white flight from the city. And we often hear about and focus on the number and proportion of white families that moved from the city during that era. But there was also Black flight, Black middle class flight, if you will, to the suburbs of Cuyahoga County, and we chronicle that in our book as well. And the result from that is, unfortunately, after the remedial order was ended and the desegregation order, and they were found, the school was deemed to be unitary once again, we saw the resegregation of our schools to the point that they were almost as segregated as they were at the outset of the court order. But it was also not only more segregated along racial lines, but now economic lines as well. Unfortunately, our urban school districts in general, not just here in Cleveland, but nationally, I think we find that dynamic of not only segregation along racial lines, but more economic lines as well. Here in Cleveland, we've seen the precipitous loss of population in our school district. I did evaluation work for CMSD throughout the 2000s. Every year that the No Child Left Behind Act was in place, I did evaluation of that program. And at the last year that I did evaluation for the school district, the population at that time was around 72,000 students in the district. And today it's less than half of that. And as we know, they're currently talking about closing more school buildings. Now, along with that, we've seen the proliferation of charter schools and the use of vouchers. Once again, Cleveland was, along with Milwaukee, the first two public school districts in the country to use public tax dollars to fund private school tuition or education, that being the voucher programs. Education is the bedrock of upward social mobility in our society. And unfortunately, we're in a moment where it's under attack as it has not been in our lifetime, mine, which is much longer than yours. This country, our diversity, first of all, is our strength. The status of this country, the vitality and vibrance of this country and the strength of this country is dependent upon the education of our population. No matter how much people don't want to accept the reality of the diversity in this country, it's not going to go away. We're going to continue to become a much more racially and ethnically diverse country, just given the birth rate and the demographics. It's critically important that we educate all of our population, give them a world-class education that gives them the opportunities to help not only themselves and their families and communities thrive, but to strengthen our nation.